So in 1854, when the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, Missourians very quickly started to move into Kansas, into state land claims, and they were the ones who came first because they were very close and close by, and they were able to come over. They staked their claims. Some people stayed, some people came back. It's a question about how many of those people intended to ever settle in Kansas. Some surely did, and others probably did not. And so during those early Kansas elections, if you looked at the population of the state of the territory of Kansas in the fall of 1854, for example, legitimately you would have seen more people who were pro-slavery than anti-slavery, or free soil, which would be a better term. But by the next year, after that next spring, when the immigrant aid societies were up and running and starting to finance people moving here, it had shifted. But what happened in the meanwhile is that the Missourians, suffering from this paranoia that I talked about earlier, they decided that they had to try to seal the deal. And so they basically, fraudulently, most people would say, had people come over from Missouri. They organized groups of men to ride into Kansas and to go to different voting locations and vote for pro-slavery for a pro-slavery government in the state of Kansas, or in the territory of Kansas, and they wouldn't have needed to have done that at this point. They would have legitimately won, but they had to seal the deal, and so you ended up with these situations where there were many, many more men voting in an election than were registered. Than legitimately lived in these areas, and it was pretty apparent to everyone involved, and especially to people at the national level and the national press, that these were fraudulent elections. Now, Nicole Etchison, who's a historian of the Bleeding Kansas era, has argued that this idea of going to vote in a place before you actually live there, but if you have the intent of moving there, is not an unusual thing on the frontier, that this happened in a lot of different places. And so that itself was not necessarily a fraudulent thing in most frontier people's minds. Although the people that were coming from New England, that's not how it worked there, and they thought it was totally beyond the pale. But the Missourians didn't, because this was kind of a way of doing things on the frontier. It was also a way of doing things to bring your guns and your knives to the election. That happened in Missouri. So it wasn't something, it was kind of a little rough and tumble. At these frontier elections, if you look at the paintings, for example, of George Caleb Bingham, you will see the booze flowing freely, and people are armed, and this is how Southerners certainly did things, but how frontier people did things. And so that was not unusual for a frontier election. But again, the New Englanders, where things were much more settled and things were more formal, they thought it was totally crazy, and they felt intimidated. And in fact, it appears that at times they were threatened by some of these Missouri ruffians, as they called them. So part of it is a sort of disconnect between people's perceptions of the way things should go. But part of it is that Missourians were really stepping over the line, and in their sort of zeal to make sure that things went their way. And, it was ludicrous what they did. And they continued to do this. It wasn't just that first election. They continued in the next couple of years to fraudulently vote in election. And it was so bad that what it ultimately ended up happening is the Free Soil people basically decided to just not participate in the elections, and they established their own government, because they felt like there was no way they were going to get a fair deal.